want to talk today about the Christian life, and I like to make things as simple as possible and as clear as possible, if it is possible. And the way I look at things, in the most simple definition or designation of things, what God does in our lives since Jesus has come and done his redemptive work on the cross, since that time. Of course, that is a great event that changed human history. The work of Jesus on the cross established a new relationship between God and man. And because of that event, God now deals with us, and really with all of humanity, but especially where I'm going to talk about living the Christian life and you and me as Christians. He deals with us by grace. Grace is the word, the broad umbrella which defines all of God's dealings in our life. Grace can be defined as God's favor. It can be defined as God's unmerited favor. I like to say it this way: grace is what God does on our behalf just because he's God. Just because he's good and just because he's God. What God does for us that we don't deserve, that comes under the umbrella of grace. Or we could just say everything that God does in our lives for our benefit and for our blessing comes under that heading of grace. The human life and the life that we live in response to that comes under the designation of faith. Now you can tell that I like those two words in looking at it, because I called the church Grace and Faith Fellowship, because that's how I see it. God's side is grace and our side is a response to that, which is faith. Of course, some people, I think, as I see it, misunderstand faith and think that by faith we're sort of reaching up into heaven and sort of grabbing God against his will and twisting his arm behind his back and sort of initiating some kind of action on God's part. But I don't see it that way. I see that God's already in the mood to act on our behalf. And he's already for us, and he already loves us. In fact, he's already done a tremendous amount for us. And that's his grace. And what we do by faith is we respond to that. You see, the Word of God tells us, the Bible tells us in Romans, that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Faith comes as a response to hearing about what God is doing, what God has done. Faith is a natural reaction to that. So we could say that the Christian life is a life of faith and the walk of faith. And we walk by faith. Paul said it that way. The life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul defined it that way. So this life that we live is a life of dependence, a life of trusting. I'm using different synonyms for faith now. It's a life of faith. And there's all kinds of subtle details that factor into this life of faith that we live. And one of those I wanted to focus on this morning. I started thinking about it from Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. If you could put that on the screen, Anton. I want to show you something and talk about a particular word. Matthew 11:28, a very familiar verse. Jesus gives an invitation, and he says, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Gives this invitation to come to him, and we do come to him as individuals. The first time, when we first come to him, that's what starts our Christian life. But we still are always depending on him and coming to him. Now, the next thing it says is, the next verse, 29, "Take my yoke upon you," and listen to this, "and learn of me." See, after we've come to him, the next thing he says is, "Hook up with me, take my yoke upon you, and learn of me." Now, this little phrase, "learn of me," could mean, the little word "of" could mean learn about me, but it could also mean learn from me. Of can mean out from, or it can mean about. So it could be, and we could look, either way is true. Learn about me, or I would prefer to say learn from me, because of the context of what he says next. Learn of me, or learn from me. For here's the first thing that we learn about him or from him. Listen, "I am meek and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls." Now, generally, when we read this, we focus on the part about he gives us rest, and he gives us rest for our souls, and that's great, and that's true. But notice that it says, when we take his yoke, or we are hooked up to him, or we come into this connection with him, that's what I understand the yoke to mean. When we take his yoke upon us, the next thing it says, "and learn of me," or learn from me, or learn about me. We learn out from him. Our learning, our growth as Christians comes from him. And the first thing he says we learn about him and from him is, "I am meek and lowly in heart." Now, this little word meek is used several times in the New Testament. It actually, I had Anton look it up for me in the Strong's Concordance, and I was kind of rushing around, didn't have time, and I said, Anton, go look that up for him. Plus, I'll tell you what, when I first bought my Strong's Concordance many years ago, I don't know if any of you have a Strong's Concordance, then you know what I'm talking about. The print is so small. It is the tiniest print you can imagine. I don't know how they printed it that size. And I didn't want to have to go find my reading glasses to see what it said. Plus, I knew Anton could just read it. So I had him go look it up for me. Go look up the word meek as it's used in this verse and tell me what it means. And it means, as you might imagine, it means essentially humble. Some of the other synonyms are gentle. But basically it means humble. The humility or humbleness is the definition. This word meek is also used with the same definition in Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. Anton, could you give me that one real quick? In the what we call the Beatitudes, Jesus uses, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And the word meek there is it's not the precise Greek word, but it essentially means the same thing. It's derived from it. It means humble or gentle, but the word humble is the primary thought. Essentially it means humble. I looked the word humble up in the dictionary, and it's interesting. The word humble, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's a negative definition. In other words, it says not. It doesn't say what it is, but it says what it's not. It says not proud, not haughty, unassuming. That's what the word humble means. And that's not really a clear, I wanted something a little more clear to say what it is, but it's not proud, not haughty, unassuming. But notice, first of all, Jesus said, learn about me, and what we learned from him and about him is he's humble, or he's meek, lowly in heart, and that's the same thought as humility. And then in this Beatitudes we see, blessed are the humble, and then he says about those who are humble, they shall inherit the earth. Now that's a pretty bold and pretty big promise. Now you would think that it would be just the opposite. In fact, the world thinks just the opposite. The world doesn't think the humble inherit anything. The world thinks the go-getters and the self-promoters are going to get all the everything, whatever there is to get, inheriting the earth. But Jesus, seeing things from an entirely different perspective than people in the world, he says, blessed are the humble, for they shall inherit the earth. And the reason is there's a little truth that I want to bring to your attention. And we're going to see it from several different places. And it basically goes like this. God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. God resists the proud, but he gives his favor. Let's say it that way. He gives his favor to the humble. Now, do you think, and do you suppose for a minute that God's favor counts for anything? Well, I suppose it really does count for a whole lot. He gives his grace, he gives his favor to the humble. Now, with that introductory thought in mind, the verse I'd like to look at, first of all, is in 1 Peter chapter 5. And there's a very familiar verse here that we quote many times, and I use it a lot, verse 7. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, a very important verse. Again, one that I alluded to it this morning, mentioned it while we were singing. Casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Very true, and it's a great verse. But I'd like to back up and get the verses before that and get the context. Peter. Peter in this chapter is talking about to the ministers first of all, and feeding the flock of God, and everybody getting along with one another within the church. In verse 5 he says this. Anton, if you could back up to verse 5. He says, likewise, ye younger, submit yourselves to the elder. And then he broadens it and makes it sort of universal, and he says, yea, or yes, all of you be subject one to another. Everybody practice being submissive and subject to one another. And then, listen to this, and be clothed with humility. And then he brings this truth that I just quoted a moment ago. For God resists the proud, but he gives grace or favor. He gives his grace or favor to the humble. So that's why Peter, he says, this is why I say, Peter's saying, be clothed with humility. It's interesting that he says that. Clothed with humility is an interesting turn of words. It implies or makes you think of taking a garment and putting it on, something you deliberately choose to clothe yourself with. You see, when you get up in the morning, you go to your closet and you look it all over and say, well, what will I wear today? The clothes just don't jump out of the closet automatically, do they? I mean, not at my house anyway. That's never happened to me. You get up in the morning and the clothes would jump onto me. And that would be nice. That would be agreeable, but that doesn't happen. We have to go and select what we wear. Am I right? In terms of clothing. Well, likewise, Peter says, here's a garment you should select and choose to put on. And you see, this is key. We choose to be clothed with this thing called humility.